Alfred Naro.
Mr Chair, it's always interesting to listen to Chardonnay socialists talk about the whole aspect of poverty. And Mr Chair, because the thing is that for all the talk, what I'd like to see is where is the action. Now, Mrs Moroney talks about a proud record under the Labour government. What she forgot to do is to continue to read the Salvation Report of 2008. And this is what it clearly says. This is this proud record that she talks about. Okay, it is said that the social outcomes achieved over the previous 5 years under the previous Labour-led government were, quote, somewhat mixed and in some areas quite disappointing. That's the record that this member talks about. Again, Chardonnay socialists, they talk about the issue of poverty, but my concern is, Mr Speaker, they don't know what true poverty is and how to work with the community to be able to solve those issues. The Salvation Army noted that more of our children appeared to be at risk of harm, more of our young people were engaged in petty crime, there was some more violent crime and more people in jail. Again, this is the record that the member just talked about. The Salvation Army talked about this, that overall New Zealanders were chronically indebted and home ownership rates had fallen. So this is the Labour government of 9 years who were in surplus, who had much to give, and yet with all that they had, with as much money that they had, they still could not solve the social issues that are there. Mr Speaker, it continued to say this, and I know they don't like to hear it. They've gone quiet on the other side, okay? Ian Lees-Galloway is yawning. Why? Because he doesn't like to hear the truth. Here's more of the truth. It listed there billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that had been spent, and yet concluded this spending seemed to have contributed very little to New Zealand's social progress. So if you're going to use the report, if you're going to use it as a basis to found your ideals, then also to read its history. Read its history. This is what it's saying. In fact, that many indicators were going backwards in 2008. There were rising numbers of referrals to SIPs, more children in SIPs care, there were rising youth offending. Mr Speaker, for all the talk and all the rhetoric, it's just a bunch of Chardonnay socialists talking about things but not getting on with action. So this is a government and a minister who's getting on with the action. Let's talk about this. Rheumatic fever prevention, $21.3 million. So that's a figure. But Mr Speaker, I was honoured to be with the Honourable Minister of Health, Tony Royal. We're at Finlayson Primary School, the largest primary school in the whole of New Zealand, predominantly Māori Pacific children, 800 kids that are there. And we launched the rheumatic fever program. Parents came along. Mr Speaker, this is not just about talk, this is about action. That's what this government is actually about. Let's talk about early childhood education and the expansion and the targeted approach. $172 million in total ECE investment. Mr Speaker, we know that it's really important not only to deal with the health issues when we talk about poverty, but what about the educational needs of our children? There are a number of our children who need to be engaged. Do you want to know what the percentage was of early childhood engagement and participation under the Labour government of 9 years? 65%. 65%. Now, if you want to talk about what's shameful, that's shameful. So what is it under the national-led government? A government of action. 88%. That's what we've got, and climbing. 88%, that's what we've got in climbing. So, Mr Speaker, we are important that we are seeing the investment in our children, absolutely important as well. 700 more children in high need, $9.3 million announced from current funding, target assistance for participation fund that's there. Let's talk about kin carers and grandparents raising grandchildren. $35 million additions, Mr Twyford. Financial help, reference group to decide how best to spend this. Let's talk about what's needed for the kids, Mr Twyford. You can have all the talk and the rhetoric, and it's all just talk. Another Chardonnay socialist who grew up in Ponsonby and somehow managed to go to the peninsula, okay? But when we talk about what's happening to the children over 9 years, nothing. Nothing. That's what happened, okay? So let's talk about what we're doing. Microfinancing. The government is exploring with banks and NGOs alternative to loan sharks for low-income earners. You see, we know where the risks are. We know where the risks are, and we're actually doing pragmatic and practical things to address this. What about housing insulation? More bedrooms, homes, land supply, Warrant of Fitness, $100 million to expand home insulation targeted for low-income families. You see, I'm just going to keep going right the way through. You're going to love this. Why? Because it's not just rhetoric, it's not just Chardonnayism, it's actually action that's actually happening on the ground. And I know Mr Prasad loves to hear this. 3,000 new state house bedrooms, 500 new homes, Warrant of Fitness trial to start with Housing New Zealand homes. We know that the issue around having affordable housing and accessible housing is absolutely critically important to our families as well. $26.6 million to extend income.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank the speakers